Hey guys, today I'd like to make a sort of introductory video to what Linux is and what Linux has to do with software development. Linux is actually a free and open source operating system. And what is an operating system? Well, an operating system acts as a sort of interface between the computer user and the computer hardware. Now, there are many different kinds of operating systems, some of the most famous ones being Windows, Unix on Mac. We have iOS, which runs on iPhones. We have Android, which runs on Android phones. And what do all of these things do? Well, they sit in between the user and the hardware. And the user is oftentimes an application. So let's take the example of iOS or Android. We usually run an app. The app communicates with the operating system. The operating system then turns the request that came in into a sort of language that the hardware can understand, and then relays that information to the hardware. And since the OS is in charge of managing the hardware, that means that it has access to the CPU, it has access to disk drives, it has access to memory, and any other external things you might have. If you're playing a game, you might want to have access to the GPU. These apps actually run on top of an operating system. So the app could have been, Python, let's say, which is a programming language. And in it, you build an application, and that application runs on an operating system. And that operating system takes in that information, turns it into a sort of computer language that the hardware can understand. Now, what makes Linux unique is that Linux is open source, which means that we can directly modify some of the features of the operating system, unlike in Windows, which is a proprietary system and is managed by Microsoft. Same with Unix or Mac. This is actually managed by Apple. Same with iOS, it's Apple, and Android is managed by Google. So we don't really have the same level of freedom to make changes in the operating system or at the operating system level. Now, a lot of times, our operating systems come with something called a GUI, or Graphic User Interface. And a Graphic User Interface is basically referring to this idea that we have interactive and visual components when working with our operating system. In Unix, we have our desktop, same with Windows. And in iOS and Android, we have a screen where we can see our applications, we can click on them, and we can interact with them, through dragging and dropping or tapping. But a lot of times in Linux distributions, we don't have a GUI. Instead, we just have something called a CLI. So the idea behind a command line is essentially that we don't have graphical icons or some sort of visual to work with that computer. We just have this box, and inside that box, we write commands. And those commands get run on the operating system, and the operating system returns us some kind of output. Now, having a CLI allows us to do a couple of things. Because our Linux operating system, or at least that distribution, doesn't have a GUI, that means that we are going to take up less space. Because now our operating system doesn't require as much space. It doesn't need all these graphical icons and audio in order to run. And because of that, we have less space. Another thing that's great about using the command line is that we have more control over the aspects of the operating system. A lot of times, a graphic user interface allows us to do some things, like we can create a new file or we can create a new folder, but doing some advanced tasks require using the CLI. And the last thing is really this idea of speed. Running commands on a command line is a lot faster than dragging your mouse and clicking around on things to accomplish the same goal. Now, learning how to use a command line is a little bit tricky at first, but I promise you it's totally worth it. 70% of the world's web servers run on Linux. And chances are, if you're working in a software company, you're going to need to work with the command line. Not too many things have a GUI. A lot of times you're running code on a bare bones server. And by bare bones, I just mean that there's no graphic interface. You just have the command line. So getting used to that fact and getting used to the idea of working with the command line opens you up to a lot more opportunities. Whether you're becoming a developer, DevOps engineer, system administrator, all these jobs require you to have a good grasp of the command line. And that is the basics of Linux. So in an upcoming video, I'm going to be talking about Linux command line basics and going over some of the basic commands that everybody who's going to work with Linux should know.